Social identity and gender development. Social identities in middle childhood. During middle childhood, children are starting to develop a sense of who and what they can do and express the feelings of competence that are referred to as a sense of industry that lead children to express a sense of identity in their adolescent years. Identity theorists ask questions based on the I and the me, such as what is the relationship between the self as knower and the self as known? And is there such thing as a unified self, or is it more appropriate to think of multiple selves? So, what is I and me? The I is the responding to the approval or disapproval of others, and the me is defining yourself according to your abilities. Theoretical viewpoints. Social identity theory and gender schema theory. Both of these approaches help in explaining how school age children construct their identity in a school group of members. Their social context is of primary importance because they develop a sense of self that is integrated with multiple intersecting identities, for example, gender and ethnicity. Symbolic interactions place the burdens of identity in a person's enactment of social rules that take place in social context. Social identity theory. Social identities are collectively based on ethnic, race, gender, or social orientation. Those who work as social identity theorists state that identity develops more individual sense of belonging to a certain group, but also the affect component of self-esteem and positive feelings. We also have in and out groups. In the in groups, there are social group whose members are similar to oneself, and in the out group, these members are perceived to be different from oneself. These two groups can be classified as stereotype. This brings us to stereotyping. What is stereotyping? Stereotyping is a set of beliefs about a person based on the person's group membership rather than the personal characteristics. For example, we could say that the belief of all boys are strong and all girls are weak. Multiple identities are contextual researchers that are more interested of how people configure on integrated identity when presented with potentially conflicting identifications such as what gender they are and the cultural values that they have. For example, a type of stereotype that says given the prevalence of gender linked racial stereotypes, African Americans must understand not just what it means to be black, but what it means to be African American, female, or male. Gender schema theory are concepts and beliefs about gender that children actively construct from their interactions with others in social contexts, whether with family at school or within the community. For example, children are able to use gender related information to interpret what toys a child might like based on the child's sex, and what middle school age children they go based on what they are interested in. According to gender schema theory, once a child has constructed gender cognitions, these beliefs are expected to influence gender understandings on themselves and others. Gender development in middle childhood. Gender differentiation is how children develop an understanding of gender differences that examine the emerges of attitude on what people should be like and how they should behave and what people should do. Gender role orientation are behaviors that are more or less stereotypical and are called sex types being masculine or feminine. and non-sex types are androgynous and undifferentiated. Masculine behaviors are more male stereotypic. They look more like competitive and aggressive. And for feminine, those behaviors look more like nurturing and more expressive. Then we have androgynous, and that means having behaviors that are combined with male and female characteristics. The undifferentiated behaviors look more typical with either sex role in varying contexts. Some developmental theorists have argued that gender behaviors will develop in their late middle childhood as a result of the onset of puberty called intensification hypothesis. Stages of gender development. In this development sequence, early childhood understandings of gender are both descriptive as to she's a girl and only girls play with dolls. By school age, children are cognitively able to separate external manifestations, like their appearance, from internal stable constructs, like gender identity. In the late middle childhood and early adolescence, between the ages of 10 to 15, tend to increase in social pressure because of gender role expectations, like dating. In these situations, many teens tend to regress to gender role stereotypes. For example, a 7th grade boy are more physically mature and spend more time on sports, as for girls spend less time on sports. Individuals who transgress gender categories are referred to as gender nonconforming. Usually, cross-gender behaviors are received as a greater disapproval when done by boys rather than girls. Usually, girls are not considered to be masculine when playing sports, but boys are seen as feminist when they pursue creative arts and literature. During middle childhood, boys and girls feel typical to feel positive self esteem when one's identity differs from one's biological or genetic sex. The descriptive term is transgender. This means the individual feels or acts like the other sex. Usually, school agers try to fit in with others by wearing gender neutral or gender typical clothing, and some start high school as clearly transgendered. Transgender refers only to gender identity and not sexuality. Sexuality identity is an organized set of self perception and attraction feelings that an individual may hold about themselves with regards to some social category, such as being gay or being straight. Sexual orientation is defined as a consistent pattern of sexual arousal towards people of the same gender in comparison fantasy, conscious attractions to emotional and romantic feelings and sexual behaviors. So, can we predict the sexual orientation of children with atypical gender identities? Studies of very feminine boys suggest that most will become gay or bisexual, and masculine girls have a greater average chance to become lesbian, and most will be heterosexual. Racial ethnic identities in middle childhood. For most children, race and ethnicity, for instance gender, is a high feature of child identity, but lately it has become incredibly difficult to define what we mean when we say race or ethnicity. Race and ethnicity are commonly defined as a sense of belonging into a social group. Today, scientists widely acknowledge that race is not a biological category because around the world the population is a small amount of total human genetic variations. Schools prefer to identify members of race and ethnicity groups as a shared culture or nation heritage, such as African Americans. Some children are often referred to as a biracial or biethnic because their parents have two different racial ethnic backgrounds. There is a more exclusive term that represents children whose identity includes two or more of the current U.S. Census Bureau as multi-ethnic. We have white, non Latino, Latino Hispanic, Black, non Hispanic or Latino, American Indian or Alaska Native, and Asian. The census of 2020 can check more than one category of one's own self description to further identify the culture heritage. Third cultural is known as a child having two or more racial ethnic backgrounds and two or more national citizenships. Racial identity refers to one's sense of self compared to others perceived by racial group. Racial identity is defined based on the assumption that racial categories are socially constructed. For example, people are usually treated as if they belong to only one biological group, like white or black, even though a racial grouping has no biological basis. Racial categories are often determined based on physical appearance, for example, the color of your skin. Most studies of racial identity describe stages of identification from low racial to ethnic awareness, often with a preference of majority culture to an appreciation of acceptance of one's own racial ethnic group. There are four stages in development of racial identity known as pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, immersion, internalization, commitment. Pre-encounter is performed to document culture values to your own culture. An example can be perceived by your physical feature as unattractive. Encounter is wanting to identify with racial minority groups, but not knowing how this could be recognized, that you will never be able to belong in to majority culture. Immersion yourself in your minority culture and rejecting the dominant society. This means participating in culture explorations and discussions of racial issues. Internalization commitment is experience a sense of fulfillment by integrating your personal and racial identities and becoming socially active by active fighting racial discrimination. For the social identity perspective, racial identity is influenced by direct interactions like parents and teachers, and indirect influences from media and peers in the social cultural environment, often called racial socialization. Racial socialization refers to laws, customs, or traditions that teach individuals to value their racial groups or themselves as a group member. In middle childhood, parents, teachers, and other practitioners increasingly help children cope with racism and discrimination. Ethnic identity refers to a sense of belonging to an ethnic group such as Latinos. Some ethnic identity research has been conducted with members of racial ethnic minorities. Those with ethnic minorities gain response to their self-identification as members, feeling of commitment, positive or negative attitudes, and a sense of shared values, transitions, and customs. Children become aware of individual differences in physical appearance, such as skin color, or of linguistic differences, such as speaking a different language during early childhood. Children at this age may also stereotype others because they may still need a single label to describe others. By the age of 8, children can recognize peers from other types of race and ethnic groups based on group memberships and just appearance and behaviors. These children are concrete thinkers because they are school-age children and typically they are able to conserve categories and other social identities like gender. By the age of 12, most children have achieved a sense to where they belong in their own ethnic group. A sense of ethnic identity and the ability to be bicultural have been found to be factors against such a problem behaviors as youth violence and agriculture or moving into the majority culture can be a high risk. Racial ethnic stereotyping. Racial ethnic identities are frequently sources of categorizing, stereotyping, and exclusion on the basis of group membership. Research has found that when exclusion occurs in the basis of group membership, children are at risk for negative self esteem, lower academic achievement, and increased bullying. Recent findings also suggest that stereotyping and prejudice is seen as wrong and unfair by school age children. Children in grades 4, 7, and 10 were asked to evaluate the appropriateness of excluding target children who are differed by gender and race ethnicity from each of the contexts. Those contexts were schools, peer groups, and relationships. Over about 80% of students viewed exclusion as wrong. Other children were likely to use fairness and justification that younger children and the majority of children also made it clear that distinctions between context and the school context, gender and racial ethnic exclusion was overwhelmingly rejected and wrong by 98% of the children. Stereotypes about race and ethnicity still affects children intergroup relationships. Social identities in context. The term context has been used in two ways by researchers. One is that which surrounds, and the second one, which weaves together. School age children are surrounded by others belonging to social identity groups. These groups can be parents, brothers and sisters, teachers, and peers. Family context. Children in late middle childhood and early adolescence become increasingly stereotypical in their sex role behavior called general intensification. This was focused on a longitudinal study of children who were between the ages of 9 and 11 years old. If gender intensification were to be presented, girls would engage in more traditionally feminine tasks and receive more parental monitoring than boys, and boys would demonstrate the opposite pattern, participating in more traditionally masculine tasks. There was no difference in parent monitoring of either boys and girls in the end hypothesis. The division of household labor was related to increasingly sex type behaviors on the part of children. Overall, gender intensification was most pronounced that girls with younger brothers are suggested that sex role traditions part may be assigned the older daughter's more feminine tasks and family is composed of both boys and girls. School context. School climate is a powerful influence of middle childhood attitudes and behaviors. For example, middle school students' perception of school climate predicted the self-esteem. One of many challenges that teachers fear in creating the positive classroom climate is the ethnicity serves as a euphemism of race. Reflecting on one's own racism and position of relative privilege in a central component of reflective practice. Recommendations by educators include an examination of your childhood, how image of yourself as a parent or teacher, how own racial ethnic identity and attitudes about others reflect your personal feeling, and examine how your background and definition of culture shape your thoughts. Those who work with school-age children need to evaluate racial ethnic biases in curriculums. Community context. One issue that hasn't been examined in middle childhood is the effect of being an undocumented immigrant. Undocumented immigrants have either entered the United States illegally or have an expired visa. There are three types of governmental responses in receiving countries that have been identified as legal definitions of who can become citizens: public discourse about immigration and migrant work, public policy initiatives. Children living in immigrant families have described their experiences of illegally as a form of community violence. An approach known as multicultural has examined how immigrants' assistance to children is enacted by adults in schools and communities and the government agencies. Some schooler assets that the identities of immigrants and children can be conceptualized as social positions that develop from their goal directed use of community resources.